The Middle Ages, a time when faith, fear, and fire forged the destiny of empires. Between the clang of steel and the screams of the fallen, men created instruments of war so cruel that even survival felt like a curse. The medieval battlefield was no place for honor. It was an arena of innovation and pain. In this age, warriors wielded weapons not just to kill, but to terrorize. Every strike was a message, every design a declaration of dominance. It wasn't enough to defeat your enemy. You had to ensure no one would ever dare rise against you again. From crushing maces that split skulls like eggs to bladed chains that turned soldiers into shredded meat, the medieval imagination was limitless in its appetite for destruction. The line between weapon and torture device often vanished completely. And the survivors? They weren't heroes. They were miracles. Because surviving a blow from these weapons weren't victory. It was punishment by endurance. In this episode, we'll journey into the heart of medieval warfare, unveiling 10 weapons so deadly that survival was pure luck. Each one tells a story of brutality, genius, and madness that define the darkest corners of human history. So, sharpen your blades and brace your nerves. From the spiked flail to the monstrous great sword, we're about to rediscover the horrors that shaped the Middle Ages. At first glance, it looks simple, a wooden club tipped with a metal ball covered in spikes. But in the hands of an angry man, the Morning Star was the ultimate equalizer. Peasants and foot soldiers, often ill-trained and poorly armored, found power in this crude yet terrifying weapon. Unlike a sword, the Morning Star didn't rely on finesse. It relied on brute force. One swing could crush armor, break bones, and leave the victim disfigured beyond recognition. The spikes were designed to pierce chainmail, while the heavy head crushed what lay beneath. Even shields were useless. The sheer momentum transferred shock through wood and steel alike. The name Morning Star was almost ironic. Some say it came from the weapon's resemblance to the rising sun. Others whisper it was a dark joke, because when this star rose, it marked the dawn of someone's death. On the battlefield, it turned men into pulp. And unlike swords that required years of mastery, anyone could learn to wield a Morning Star in minutes. That made it not just deadly, but terrifyingly democratic. In medieval rebellions, like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, farmers, blacksmiths, and miners took up Morning Stars against knights. Their crude craftsmanship hid a lethal truth. No amount of training could save you from a perfectly swung spike. Survival wasn't about skill. It was about luck. If the Morning Star found you, not even prayer could help. If the Morning Star was brutal simplicity, the flail was calculated chaos. Imagine a heavy spiked ball attached to a chain, swinging freely from a handle. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a physics experiment in carnage. The flail's greatest strength was unpredictability. A knight's shield could block a sword or axe, but flail? It curved around defenses and struck from impossible angles. One misjudged swing, and you could crack open a helmet like a nut. But the weapon was as dangerous to its wielder as to its enemy. A poorly timed motion could send the ball flying back into one's own face. Only the most skilled or reckless dared to use it. On the battlefield, it turned formations into chaos. Even the sound, the metallic whirring of the chain, struck fear before the blow ever landed. Chroniclers described it as the devil's dance, and with good reason. The flail also carried symbolic power. In some depictions, even angels and saints were shown wielding it against demons, a divine answer to evil. Yet in mortal hands, it often served the opposite purpose, pure terror. When a knight charged a flail, soldiers scattered, not because they feared death, but because no one wanted to die that way. Skulls shattered, armor dented into flesh, and bones ground to paste. Few survived a flail strike, and those who did often wished they hadn't. As plate armor evolved, sword began to fail. The glancing blows, the futile strikes. It became clear that something new was needed. Thus was born the warhammer, small, compact, and devastatingly efficient. The warhammer wasn't made to cut. It was made to crush. On one side, a blunt hammerhead smashed metal and bone. On the other, a deadly spike punched through armor like paper. It was a perfect marriage of physics and savagery. Knights found themselves in horror when faced with it. A well-placed strike could cave in a helmet, rupture organs, or paralyze instantly. Armor might save you from bleeding, but not from internal destruction. The most feared versions were mounted on long poles, turning them into pole hammers, allowing soldiers to strike from a distance with even more power. Against mounted knights, it was devastating. The warhammer didn't just kill, it erased status. No matter how rich, noble, or holy you were, this weapon reduced everyone to the same broken pulp beneath steel. Survivors were often left crippled for life, ribs shattered, skulls dented, joints dislocated. Even in victory, the battlefield was littered with groaning men praying for death. It was said, the sword writes history, the hammer ends it. At first glance, the halberd looks like a glorified axe on a stick. But on the medieval battlefield, it was a masterpiece of versatility. A spear, axes, and hook all in one. Soldiers armed with halberds didn't need elegance. They needed dominance. And this weapon delivered both. Developed in 14th century Switzerland, the halberd became the bane of armored cavalry. When knights charged with lances and pride, the halberdier stood ready. With its long reach, he could thrust the spear tip to unhorse a rider, swing the axe to crush a skull, or use the rear hook to drag enemies off their mounts. The weapon was an equalizer, and it turned noble knights into easy prey. The secret of the halberd was its adaptability. Against infantry, it cut and pierced. Against cavalry, it hooked and yanked. And in tight formations, halberdiers fought like a living wall of death, synchronized, unstoppable, and coldly efficient. Account from battles like Morgarten 1315 describes Swiss farmers decimating armored knights using halberds with terrifying precision. One survivor said, "It was as if death itself had grown arms." But wielding a halberd wasn't easy. It required strength, timing, and brutal courage. The weapon's length made close combat suicidal, and its heavy head could tire a man within minutes. But for those who mastered it, it was divine wrath forged in iron. Even kings feared it. By the 15th century, halberds guarded royal courts, not against armies but against betrayal. When the axe fell, it fell with authority. On the battlefield or in an execution courtyard, the halberd reminded everyone, armor, wealth, or title, none could protect you when death came swinging. Unlike the clumsy bows of earlier eras, the crossbow didn't require years of training or noble birth. It needed only steady hands and cold patience, and that's what made it so feared. The crossbow changed warfare forever. It turned peasants into king killers. With a simple mechanism, a wooden stock, a steel bow, and a crank, even an untrained soldier could pierce a knight's armor from hundreds of feet away. The church condemned it as unholy. In 1139, the Second Lateran Council even tried to ban it, calling it a weapon hateful to God and unfit for Christians. But that didn't stop armies from using it. The weapon was too effective and too efficient to be abandoned. At the Battle of Hastings, crossbowmen reshaped the fight. Later, in the Crusades, Saracen and European troops alike unleashed volleys that darkened the sky. The impact was horrifying. A bolt from a heavy crossbow could puncture chainmail, pierce organs, and nail a man to his horse. The victims often died slowly, suffocating or bleeding internally. And the psychological terror was immense. You never saw the shooter, only the aftermath. Crossbowmen were despised yet indispensable. They symbolized a new age of war, one where skill and valor mattered less than precision and technology. To medieval knights, the crossbow was an insult. To everyone else, it was justice served cold. Long before cannons roared, the trebuchet ruled the battlefield as the most terrifying siege weapon of the Middle Ages. A marvel of engineering and destruction, it could hurl 300-pound stones over 200 meters with terrifying accuracy, obliterating walls, towers, and men alike. Unlike the catapult, which used tension, the trebuchet relied on gravity. A massive counterweight dropped, launching projectiles with tremendous force. It was elegant mathematics turned into monstrous reality. But stones weren't the only ammunition. Historical records tell of commanders launching diseased corpses, animal carcasses, and even severed heads into besieged cities to spread fear and plague. The sky itself became a weapon. One infamous example was the siege of Acre, 1189 to 1191. during the Crusades, where trebuchets rained destruction day and night. Chroniclers described the constant thunder as the voice of God in wrath. Operating a trebuchet required teamwork, precision, and cold detachment. Each launch was a performance of death. Engineers shouting, ropes creaking, and stones shattering everything they touched. There was no defense. Walls crumbled, towers collapsed, and men were crushed into dust. Survivors described the battlefield as a landscape of bones. The trebuchet wasn't a weapon of soldiers. It was a weapon of civilizations. When it appeared on the horizon, it meant only one thing: annihilation. Few weapons carry as much legend as a longsword, the elegant yet merciless blade of knights and kings. But behind its noble image lies a weapon of unmatched lethality. Measuring up to 4 feet in length, the longsword was built for versatility, stabbing, slashing, crushing, and countering all in one motion. In the hands of a trained warrior, it was poetry and punishment combined. Masters of the blade trained in brutal martial systems like German Fechtbuch, combat manuals that read more like lessons in anatomy than chivalry. Every swing aimed for arteries, joints, or gaps in armor. It was precision disguised as grace. The sword's power wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. To wield it was to command authority, to carry divine right. Yet on the battlefield, it cared little for nobility. The blade did not discriminate. In duels, the longsword transformed men into dancers of death. One mistake meant disembowelment or decapitation. And in war, lines of soldiers fell before its reach. The edge could cleave through bone as if it were parchment. Those who survived a long sword strike rarely did so whole. Limbs were lost, spines severed, faces ruined. Ironically, the sword that symbolized honor was also one of the most efficient tools of suffering ever forged. In the end, the longsword's beauty wasn't in its shine. It was in its precision to destroy. Before gunpowder, the ballista was mankind's attempt to weaponize the power of thunder. Essentially a giant crossbow powered by twisted sinew or rope. It could launch bolts and spears with devastating velocity, capable of impaling multiple men at once. Ancient in design but perfected in the Middle Ages, the ballista was both siege engine and psychological warfare. Its bolts, sometimes over 6 feet long, tore through armor, walls, and flesh alike. When fired, it let out a groaning shriek that chilled soldiers to the bone. Ballistas were used not just against fortifications, but against people. Chronicles tell of commanders targeting enemy generals or standard-bearers, decapitating leadership in an instant. One hit could shatter morale and bodies alike. At the siege of Constantinople, the Byzantine ballistae unleashed volleys that turned advancing troops into crimson mist. Witnesses described men being pinned like insects upon the ground. The weapon was mechanical genius, precise, reusable, and horrifying. Unlike catapults that hurled chaos, the ballista delivered surgical death. Survivors were rare. Those struck often didn't even have time to scream. In an age without mercy, the ballista was divine judgment, silent, sudden, and absolute. In the shadowy world of assassins and spies, the scorpion blade was legend. Compact, concealable, and merciless, it was a hidden weapon of medieval intrigue, where death came not from the battlefield, but from the shadows. Crafted with a spring-loaded mechanism, the blade could extend from a wrist or sleeve in a heartbeat. Perfect for a sudden strike. Some designs even included poison reservoirs, ensuring death even from a scratch. Unlike the swords and hammers of knights, the scorpion blade didn't announce its arrival. It whispered it, and its victims often didn't realize they'd been struck until it was too late. While historical records are scarce, accounts from Byzantine and Italian courts tell of nobles falling suddenly at banquets or in corridors. Wounds so small they were almost invisible. Many believed demons or curses were responsible, but it wasn't magic. It was innovation, the dark ingenuity of men who made death elegant. In the hands of assassins, this weapon symbolized the evolution of warfare, from brute force to silent precision. It was the beginning of a new kind of fear, one where you didn't need an army to kill a king. The scorpion blade marked the end of the age of chivalry and the dawn of the age of secrecy. Because in a world of steel and shadows, survival wasn't skill. It was luck, and luck always ran out. From spiked maces to siege monsters, these weren't just weapons. They were nightmares made real. Which of these medieval horrors do you think was the most terrifying? Tell us in the comments. And if you enjoy stories of history's darkest inventions, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell, because the past still has more blood to spill. This is the Crit Stories, where history bleeds.